Hello and welcome to Season 9, Episode 5 of Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queers in history. My name is Ben Miller. I am a writer and historian currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernrich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
Last week, we talked about Jacob Israel de Haan, a Dutch gay writer turned Zionist poet turned anti-Zionist political activist who was assassinated by the Haganah. Who are we talking about this week, Hugh?
Today we're discussing a strange and quite compelling figure, the photographer Angela Calomiris. We can start at the end of her life, actually, as a denizen of Provincetown, the little resort at the tip of Cape Cod in Massachusetts that's long been a haven for LGBTQ people.
Massachusetts mentioned. Actually, the pixie gay civics and history teacher at my high school that saved my life, who's now unfortunately passed away, Ty Vignon, his summer job was he would work as the bartender on the Boston to Provincetown fast ferry.
He almost certainly knew Angela then. Angela, Angie to her friends, owned a row of waterfront cottages in the resort which she let out that were called Angel's Landing, which still exists. It was the 1980s and 90s, and Angie had a reputation as a formidable figure in the town, as a tough and not always fair businesswoman. She'd made good money through some pretty stiff deals with other people, but she was regarded as generous, if quite eccentric by others. She was involved in the Women's Innkeepers Association, and she offered help and support to women who were arriving in town in difficult circumstances. She was a butch, a petite woman, and she wore a men's blazer and a fisherman's cap. There's some great photos of her, actually. And she was frequently seen in the company of, let's say, tall, younger women.
I love a tall, younger woman. It's interesting, when you talk about tough businesswoman, you do need to be a tough business person to survive in a resort town like that. I know people who live out the Cape, and basically any business out there has 8 weeks to make all of their money for the entire year. And the rest of the year is just survival for the 8 weeks of summer. And so it can be quite brutal in that kind of environment.
Yeah, and she was successful. She was really the epitome of a sort of successful older lesbian who'd got in on the ground floor of the Provincetown property boom. And she was now a sort of mini real estate mogul in the area, owning multiple properties. So much, in fact, that she could actually afford her own holiday home in Mexico. Yet behind Angie's role as a sort of local doyenne of the scene, she trailed a dark secret about her life as a young photographer in New York. According to an article in a Provincetown banner published after her death, one summer another photographer, Gloria Nardin, arrived in the resort looking for a place to stay. She was directed to Angie down at Angel's Landing. Quote, "I'd heard the rooms were good and wonderfully inexpensive," Nardin recalled. "I had just agreed to rent the place when the owner pulled out her card. It was Angela Calomiris. I pretended I'd forgotten my checkbook and ran. To this day, I'm sorry I didn't confront her." End quote. How did Angela end up in Provincetown, and why was the mere sight of her name enough to induce horror in a fellow photographer? In today's episode, we'll discuss Angela's life of secrets and lies. So Angela was born in 1916 in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Her parents were Greek immigrants to the US, and her father was a scab furrier. He was a strikebreaker who used to break labor organizing in the fur and leather industry in the first few decades of the 20th century, which is hardly a sort of auspicious start to her life. As a teenager, she got a job delivering the New York Evening Graphic, an extremely lowbrow tabloid newspaper that had become famous for its composographs, which were these sort of composite photographic illustrations that were airbrushed, made up to depict news items that they didn't have photos for, such as Rudolph Valentino ascending to heaven and being welcomed in by Caruso, which was one of the composographs. So Calomiris' family only read Greek newspapers, and there's no photographs in Greek newspapers, and she was bewitched by this technology, and she decided there and then that she wanted to be a photographer when she grew up. But her young life was pretty hard. When she was 7, her father died, and her mother, who was unable to support the family, sent her and her younger sister to the Severe Home for Children, an orphanage in the Bronx.
I'm sorry, is it literally called the Severe Home for Children?
Severe in Spanish.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were calling it the Severe Home for Children, which
probably
even for a 1920s reformatory is a particularly terrible name.
Mrs. Trunchbull's School for Girls.
And the Severe Home for Children, you just can't make it up.
So she was sent there, but that was only temporary, because at some point she actually moved back in with her mother. But you can imagine that sort of a girls' orphanage in the Bronx in the 1920s would be a particularly miserable experience for a child. And as soon as she could, she moved out of her mother's home. She'd actually tell people later that her mother was dead when she wasn't. But anything that she told about her life that we can't explicitly corroborate should definitely be taken with a pinch of salt, because she was prone to telling porcupines for lots of reasons. So Angie moved down to Greenwich Village, which at the time was a sort of cheap and cosmopolitan neighborhood that was a home of the creative vanguard of US culture at the time. There was a Cafe Society, which was the first racially integrated nightclub in America. You could find a young, not yet drippy Jackson Pollock selling his paintings on the sidewalk. You could visit the Cherry Lane Theatre and the Whitney Museum of American Art. And you could also attend classes at the New School, a progressive research university, which by the time Angela moved to the village was home to many Jewish scholars and intellectuals who had fled the Nazi regime in Germany. This was also a time of the New Deal, Roosevelt's wide tranche of economic and social reforms aimed at tackling the effects of the Great Depression on American society. As you can imagine, it was a time of great creativity and freedom, but also of political organizing and concern for the social problems of America, and especially on the left. Angela found herself living right in the middle of this world, and it seems she took to it almost immediately. She got a job with Esther Leib, the peace activist and journalist who was part of the older generation of lesbians born during the Gilded Age. Leib and her lover, Elizabeth Reed, were friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, cough cough, who spent a lot of time in a village with this coterie of lesbians who were involved in Democratic Party and suffragist causes.
How strange that Eleanor Roosevelt would spend so much time with lesbians.
Yes. And it seems plausible that she got the job with Leib through the connections in the queer circles, just as she probably did when she later got a job with Hal Fife, who was a Broadway photographer and, let's say, confirmed bachelor. So this, after all, was the purpose of queer communities at the time, mutual support in a hostile world. But unfortunately, that's not a lesson that Angie would learn. Her time with Fife clearly led her further into photography. She took some classes in the subject. Later, she'd claimed she'd been at the New School, probably under the legendary American photographer Berenice Abbott, herself a lesbian, who at the time was employed by the New Deal enterprise, the Federal Art Project. But her most important education was with the Photo League, a workers' cooperative of photographers in New York, where she was given training in darkroom time by one of the league's founders, Sid Grossman.
I love to be given training and darkroom time.
There's going to be lots of darkroom mentions in this episode, Ben, so get all the jokes out now. So,
where was your darkroom training?
At school. So the League was really important in the story of photography in New York in the 20th century. Abbott herself was involved in the League, and its members and supporters and people who gave talks and things like that included Ansel Adams, the famous press photographer Ouija, and Helen Levitt. And it's worth going into the history of the League and what was happening in photography at the time, because it will actually be crucial to Calomiris' later story. The Photo League was a part of a movement of photographers who were enabled both by their political concerns and by technological developments of handheld cameras, and they looked to use photography as a way of recording and commenting on society around them. They'd moved away from the idea of posed studio portraits or large landscapes, and they were really interested in capturing the truth of everyday life. They were hugely influenced by social documentary photography, especially of photographers like Lewis Hine, who took photos of child labourers and migrants and skyscraper construction crews and things like that, highlighting these social issues. And so there was some crossover with the work that was produced by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, this New Deal agency, and the FSA, the Farm Security Administration. And these were agencies who used photographers like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, very famous photographs of the migrant mother and things like this, to bring the sort of plight of America's poorest, including especially migrants and farmers, to public attention, because that increased support for the welfare and employment programs under Roosevelt.
It was, however, as potential future subject of the show Mark Blitzstein discovered when he wrote a communist opera called The Cradle Will Rock with WPA funding, possible to be too left-wing for the WPA.
Yeah, it definitely was.
They did shut some stuff down. So it is important to remember all of these moments when left-wing organizing and left-wing artistic projects were supported by the U.S. federal government. And also important to remember that there was also always pushback and complication and limits even within the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah. That's telling here, because I guess you could say the Photo League went further in a lot of their work.
I wonder if there's any connection to an organization called the Hollywood Film and Photo League, which Harry Hay was actually a member of, which is where kind of all the communist arty people in LA were hanging out.
Almost certainly,
at this time.
Almost certainly, because we'll go into the sort of communist roots of the Photo League, and there were different organizations across the US.
And the Hollywood Film and Photo League was also where Harry Hay met a lesbian actress named Regina Call, who recruited him to play the organ at the Crowleyan Temple of Thelema for the Gnostic Mass.
Well, the New York Photo League was originally part of the Workers' Film and Photo League, and that split at some point, of course. Because
was it a cooperative film and photo league?
So the Photo League actually wasn't exactly the same as these sort of WPA photographers. First off, like, obviously it wasn't a government organization. And secondly, it wanted to capture a much broader swathe of society, like the rich as well as the poor, capturing the whole city. And many of the league members, and especially Grossman, felt that the photographer as an individual with his own or her own emotional and political and aesthetic senses was a key part of the process of photography, not just someone who presses a shutter, but someone who really frames the image. It was reintroducing that figure of the photographer into the process. And that really betrayed the more radical roots of the Photo League. As we were saying, the group emerged from a split within the Workers' Film and Photo League, an avowedly left-wing organization which actually had received support from the Communist Party. The Workers' Film and Photo League was itself influenced by Workers' International Relief, which was a Comintern, a communist international, founded organization that was started in Germany to provide material and propaganda support for the Soviet Union in the early 20s. And it was founded by this really fascinating man, a KPD propagandist called Willy Munzenberg. And
Munzenberg.
Yeah. And he was really attuned to the possibilities of communication technologies that were emerging at the time, these mass media technologies like film and photography, and their use in the fight for communism. And the Workers' International Relief published this magazine, forgive my German pronunciation, Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung.
Arbeiter Illustrierter Zeitung.
There you go. Which was a very popular magazine which featured photography from the workers' movement as well as art from artists like John Hartfield, who is my personal hero, Kati Kollwitz, and George Gross.
We should someday, when you're here in Berlin, Hugh, go visit John Hartfield's house.
Oh, I'd love that.
John Hartfield's summer house.
Absolutely. So we're talking about an organization whose members had a political ideology that was drawn clearly from the left, although whose own cultural politics and attitudes towards image making specifically was markedly different, and one might even say American, compared to their European communist counterparts who are more influenced by the moves towards socialist realism that were happening.
Yeah, this is also one of the sort of the beginning of tensions within the broader kind of global socialist movement, which before Stalin tends to be very much allied with the artistic avant-garde, and then because of Stalin becomes much more conservative, A, in matters of sexuality and gender and kind of morality, and B, in terms of artistic production, right? And these tensions end up climaxing with the kind of rebellion in the U.S. left about the American Communist Party endorsing Molotov-Ribbentrop in 1938. But it's just important to keep that in mind, right? That's also happening at this time, and like some people are going with Stalin and some people aren't.
Yeah, and in the revolution in Russia and under Lenin, there was this burst of avant-garde and really mind-blowingly creative leaps forward in image production, especially image making. And you have Disov, Dzigas Vertov and Malevich and like all these amazing things happening. And then that gets really suppressed under party control under Stalin. I think it says actually his son-in-law, Zhdanov Ischechina, I've pronounced that really, really wrong, but this was this move that's more commonly known as socialist realism, and it's this move towards producing idealistic images of the Soviet worker as the new man, Homo Sovieticus, which is really important in that era. And probably when a lot of people think back to what communist imagery is, quote unquote, they'll think of these sort of socialist realist posters, but that's very different to how the movement was in the early 1920s.
R.I.P.
So Angela came to hear about the League through her girlfriend, a photographer called Peggy Vaughan. Peggy was a member of the League, and she also edited occasionally Photo Notes, which was the magazine in which the League published their work. The League did a lot of publishing work, and they also put on a lot of exhibitions. So
now I'm going to refer going into a dark room as being a member of the League.
So Peggy and Angela lived together in an apartment on Jane Street in the village. And probably what first attracted her to the group was how cheap it is. It was just $5 a year for membership, which gave her access to a dark room. Make the joke here, Ben. And $5 again for a 16-week course. That would amount to just, I don't know, $100 or $200 today. So really cheap for access to photographic equipment. And in 1941, she joined the League and she began attending classes. And she loved documenting what she called the, quote, many human dramas of the city, which was exactly what the League existed for. So from the outside, it looks like Angela had it relatively lucky. Of course, like America in the 1930s was never going to be a great place to be a poor working class woman or a lesbian, and especially not a butch dyke, which is what Angela was. But if you had to live anywhere, living in Greenwich Village with your girlfriend close to the gay bars with a cheap entry to a fulfilling career alongside these like-minded creative people who are very talented, great photographers, you could do a lot worse. All of this makes Angela's next decision absolutely bizarre. Just a year after joining the League, she claimed she was visited at her Greenwich Village apartment one morning by two FBI agents, Kenneth Beerley and William South, who attempted to recruit her to become an informant for the Bureau. So this was 1942. The Soviet Union and the United States were now officially allies. And under the authority of the Comintern, the Communist Party USA was officially backing the US government, including opposing all strikes in war industries. And in return, the US government was lifting many of the restrictions it had put in place in the 1930s against the party. This is the era in sort of Western propaganda where Stalin becomes Uncle Joe, this sort of cuddly ally figure. So
there's movies being made in Hollywood about our Soviet brothers.
Yes. So one of these restrictions that had been put in place in the 30s against communists was the Smith Act, a law that made it an offence to advocate or plan the overthrow of the US government by force. And the Socialist Workers' Party was prosecuted under the Smith Act in 1941, something which the Communist Party, who were obviously enemies of the SWP, supported because they were against the Trotskyists. But J. Edgar Hoover, the paranoid, red-baiting head of the FBI, who we featured on an earlier episode, wasn't so easily convinced, and he was still running these undercover investigations against the party. So Angie thought about the offer, but not for very long, and a week later she accepted the proposal, becoming a paid informer and starting her infiltration of the cultural left building around the Photo League.
Fuck her.
Yes. So her first mission was to gain information on the Communist Party, and her best way in was through her tutor and fellow League member Sid Grossman. He was this deeply passionate man, and that passion sometimes did get interpreted as anger, both about the power of photography and about the need for social change. And the FBI were already suspicious of him, not least because he'd been taking photos of social deprivation and labor organizing and things like this. And he was also a long-time member of the Communist Party for at least 5 years, and probably a lot more. And his nickname within the League was actually the Commissar, for the intensity of his political beliefs. And it was, according to Angie, it was Grossman who recruited her to join the Communist Party. But she didn't stop there. According to a 1951 book by George Marion, she also joined, quote, an AFL union and a CIO union, the American Labour Party, the Progressive Party, the International Workers' Order, the Congress of American Women, Greeks for Democratic Action, the Joint Anti-Fascist Committee, and at least 5 others. And that's what you say about the problem with socialism. It takes too many evenings.
Yeah. And you get too much mail.
Yeah. So once she was inside the party, she dedicated herself to climbing through its ranks as quickly as possible, partly through volunteering to do the grunt work, basically. She also stayed active in the Photo League during the war, working as the executive secretary of the organization, a role which provided her with access to lots of information about its members. But it was in the Communist Party where she made the most inroads as an organizer within her local Midtown branch. So she would stay in the party as an FBI informant for the following 7 years. They were really important years for the Communist Party USA because the end of the Second World War obviously heralded the first days of the Cold War and a change within the party from being this more open mass membership political party to one engaging once again in clandestine organizing and having a much more rigid Stalinist orthodoxy. But it was clandestine for good reason, because this Uncle Joe cuddly Stalin of the World War II alliance has gone, and in its place arrived, of course, this new idea of the Red Menace. So just like at the end of World War I, the end of World War II meant this huge number of returning demobilized soldiers who were looking for work, an end to this industrial peace between employers and unions, and of course a desire by those who had sacrificed during the war to live in a peace that was fit for heroes, as they say.
Yeah, and in 1944, when Roosevelt gets the nomination of the Democratic Party for an unprecedented 4th time, His vice president from 40 to 44, a very left-wing guy to his left named Henry Wallace, who's favored as the successor by Eleanor and some other people, loses renomination as vice president due to conservative forces in the party worried about what's going to happen when Roosevelt dies. And they were worried that Henry Wallace would actually continue the alliance with the Soviet Union and take America, if not red, then perhaps pink. And maybe they were right to be worried. Henry Wallace, at this point, starts making speeches and establishing himself politically as an independent figure after Harry Truman, of course, is given the vice presidential nomination, a much more conservative guy. Has all this stuff about the speeches about the era of the common man coming upon us. The famous Aaron Copland fanfare for the common man is specifically a pro-Henry Wallace communist musical propaganda.
I didn't know that.
Yep. And then Henry Wallace runs for president in 1948 on an independent progressive ticket supported by the left. And actually, it's Harry Hay gets started in gay organizing again by organizing a Gays for Henry Wallace group in 48.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So,
Henry Wallace remaining vice president is one of those huge, very personalized what ifs in U.S. history, because if Roosevelt had died and Henry Wallace had taken over and seen out the last days of the war, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah. But what did happen was that there was this sort of fear amongst bosses and politicians about the left sort of reorganizing and making these big social changes to the capitalist system. And of course, there's also this fear of the infiltration and influence of a sort of Soviet communism.
Yeah.
So after World War I, the US had its first Red Scare, which was when the FBI was formed by Hoover. And then by the end of the Second World War, Hoover had become a veteran Red Baiter, and he was joined by figures like Roy Cohn and Senator Joe McCarthy, who saw the ability to make political capital by feeding this public fear of communism. So as soon as the war had ended in Europe, and while it was actually still going on in the Pacific Theatre, Hoover began building a case against the party under the Smith Act, despite the fact that its membership figures were already collapsing at this point. And it was informants like Angela who provided the raw materials for that case. As a photographer, she was frequently taking photographs for the party of actions and events like the annual May Day parade, and would then pass copies of all the photographs to her handlers, including the names of those depicted. All the time.
Fuck her.
All the time she was assiduously collecting details on other members, their names and aliases, what they said at meetings, who their friends were, what unions they were a part of, so on, and passing everything to the FBI.
And there's people who have written really movingly about the experience of this from the other side, right? Mm-hmm. Like having organized with people and been in really tight community with people and suddenly realizing that they're like these people that you thought were your friends have been secretly reporting on you. Like it's so paranoia-making and destabilizing. And that's actually part of the effect, and I think part of the desired effect of this kind of infiltration is to make people not trust each other and to make people not organize together and to make people forget lessons of previous generations of lefts because people burn out and get paranoid and crazy. Yeah. Making people forget lessons from the left. People ask why all of this, there's a certain kind of the American flavor of a certain kind of Little Britain Marxism, right? That basically says, oh, the new left and they forgot all these lessons and they organized so poorly and blah, blah, blah. And why do you think that fucking was? It was because in America, the old left was comprehensively destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a strategy that still obviously goes on today. Like the spy cop scandal in the UK is exactly that.
Absolutely.
It's criminal. So we've talked a bit before on this podcast about the Lavender Scare, which was this moral panic in the early part of the 50s in the USA, which raised this spectre of sex perverts, meaning homosexuals.
You called?
Who had infiltrated the US government, supposedly, and were a threat to US national security. And regular listeners will also have heard me talk a lot about my obsession between the link between spies and homosexuality, especially in the UK, but also in the US in the 20th century. And there's a great book on the subject of the Lavender Scare by David K. Johnson. You might also be aware of it from the novel Fellow Travellers by Thomas Mallon, and also a preposterously anachronistic miniseries with Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey, where all these supposedly hard-drinking, desk-bound State Department workers somehow all possess washboard abs. Despite the fact that, the one who's always drinking milk, Jonathan Bailey's character is constantly drinking milk. That's his personality, but yet has this.
We've discussed that show on Extra Bad Gays. If you want to hear us be catty about Matt Bomer shows, please subscribe at patreon.com/badgayspod.
So, given that there was such a sort of deep psychological anxiety around homosexuals, both being security risks and potentially being these sort of seditious cancers within the body politic of the nation, is it not strange that they chose Angela, a very clearly lesbian woman, as a spy? Which I think is a really good question. In Angie's telling in her later autobiography, her recruiter regarded a lack of interpersonal ties and especially family ties as a benefit to any spy, and that's quite a common thing. She certainly had very little to tie her down, as can be attested by the number of roles that she took in the League and the party. There's also a hint in Elisa Davis's excellent biography of Calomiris that perhaps the FBI agents didn't just stumble upon her, but she was recommended by another informant and perhaps another lesbian. Meanwhile, the wife of Sid Grossman was not alone in suggesting that Angela herself perhaps had been blackmailed by the FBI on account of her sexuality. But to me, that seems unlikely because she didn't actually go to any particular lengths to hide her sexuality. The other thing to bear in mind is that the Communist Party was no more friendly to queer people than the FBI at the time. It was not only ideologically forbidden, it was seen as a sort of bourgeois deviation in line with the Stalinist rhetoric from the 30s. But it was also a security consideration, just as the State Department feared that gays could be easily blackmailed by communists. So communists feared that the gays could be easily blackmailed by the State Department. But both lesbians and gay men were ejected from the party, although it often adopted a don't ask, don't tell policy. And of course, many future organisers within the gay rights movement did cut their activist teeth in the party, including famously Harry Hay.
Although, famously, Harry Hay was basically forced into a marriage with a female comrade when he joined.
Yeah.
So he went back in the closet and then came out again.
But also, of course, Bob Hull and Chuck Rowland, who are both founding members of the Mattachine Society. But ironically, many of these men and women would then be ejected in turn from the Mattachine Society during the Lavender and the Red Scares, precisely because of their links to communism. There was no space for them.
Right. They outed themselves and left. They outed themselves not as gay, but as the founders, and left at this famous convention in 1953. And it was specifically a newspaper article in L.A. that had picked up on the fact that these were potentially communists. And the guy wrote that if the Kinsey report is right and 10% of LA is gay, and these gays are all communists, and they form the, get ready for a great word, Comintern,
Yes.
then they would have this vast population of people, and they could suddenly replace the entire city council with homosexual communists, which sounds like a party to me.
Chance
but,
to be a
you know.
fine thing, yeah. So in 1940...
It's like that Simpsons meme where the newscaster with a very depressed face and the thought bubble, and a thought bubble, it's like people dancing around in a circle in Utopia with the rainbow.
So in 1948, there was a whispering campaign that was started within the party against Angela, with people calling for the party to investigate her. She was accused of anti-party behaviour and asked to resign, but she actually refused, and so instead she was demoted to the role of financial secretary, something that ironically gave her even deeper access to their membership roles.
Yeah, don't...
Yeah.
What? Oh, it's stupid.
Yeah.
Stupid.
I think at this point they didn't have enough people to go around, like the party was collapsing. And she had all these lists, of course, of due-paying members of the party to hand. And she stayed there until she emerged spectacularly into public view as an FBI stool pigeon in 1949. So Hoover had been building his case against the party, and he wanted to crush it in a similar manner to how the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a revolutionary industrial union, was crushed in the aftermath of the First World War. So in June of 1948, the Department of Justice arrested 11 of the top members of the party, including the General Secretary, the leader of the Young Communist League, and the editor of the party newspaper, The Daily Worker. But Hoover was disappointed because he has hoped to pick off the entire national board of the party, which had been 55 members in total. But the trial began in 1949, charging the men with having broken the Smith Act by advocating and organising a violent revolution against the US government. The trial marked the real ramping up of the Red Scare, coming a year before the trial of the alleged spy Alger Hiss, the Korean War in the same year, and of course Joe McCarthy's famous list. The accused denied the charges, saying they were involved only in legal, political organising and education, and the party had to throw itself into a fundraising drive to pay for their legal defence, and Angela was part of that operation. She actually donated $50 of her own money to the fund. She was still a member of the party, she was still paying her dues, so it must have been a terrible shock for the accused when the prosecution called a witness to the stand, and up walked Angela Calomiris, a seemingly loyal party member. And her testimony was extensive. She spent 5 days on the stand outlining the party's strategies, beliefs and membership roles from the position of an insider. She also indicted the Photo League, which she claimed was not a legitimate cultural organisation, but a front for the party. She was, according to the FBI, quote, an excellent confidential informant who kept the New York office completely advised of any information coming to her attention relative to activities of the Communist Party USA, end quote. The defense, on the other hand, tried to raise repeatedly Angela's sexuality in order to discredit her, but it didn't work. The judge and the public were definitively on her side. In the end, the jury too, all 11 were convicted and sentenced to prison, and the judge then jailed their defense team for contempt of court. Yikes. So for Angela, a new dawn was breaking. Despite her repeated claims to the contrary, she was actually paid very handsomely by the FBI for her work as an informant. And she was promised further work as a photojournalist after the trial, but these jobs never really materialized. And with her income dried up, she became for a while something of a celebrity, crossing America to talk about her role as a brave and selfless patriot who gave up her career to help save America from communism. Much like today, there's a very good grift to be made in appealing to the right, especially as an apostate, someone who was in the left and had turned against it. And Hoover was appalled with this. He said, quote, she disgusted him, but I think probably most women disgusted Hoover. And so he cut off the funding to her, and ironically, of course, that forced her to do more publicity. She was also becoming a bit of a pest. She even managed to obtain a press pass to turn up to later trials, this time with her new girlfriend, Myrtis Johnson, who was the sister-in-law of Kenneth Beerley, her original FBI handler who recruited her to the cause. So Beerley had quit the Bureau in 1946 and started his own anti-communist publishing house. And he and Angela had become close friends, and together they launched Counterattack, a regular newsletter/magazine that investigated communist influence in American society. So they'd launched these attacks that outed the Red Menace in industry and commerce, but especially in the media. They had this very smart money-making ruse. They began to target Hollywood at a time when the House Un-American Activities Committee was rooting out communists and fellow travelers. And they also produced this document called Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and TV, which was the original Hollywood blacklist. So being blacklisted was like a terrible price to pay for one's political commitment, and it would destroy the careers of some really great actors and producers and directors. And it would also split Hollywood in later years, as those who had named names, like Elia Kazan, were rightfully never forgiven by those whose careers were damaged or destroyed.
One fabulous story, if you don't know it, is the brilliant comic actress Judy Holliday, star of Bells Are Ringing, who developed, as per like her act, basically, her persona was this ditzy blonde, but she was actually very smart and extremely politically committed communist. She's hauled in front of the committee and manages to get off by playing her like character in front of the committee, and she just gets them all laughing and just walked out not being charged, not blacklisted, and not having named a single name.
It's funny you mentioned Judy Holliday, because she'll come up later in this story.
Oh my God.
But yeah, there were lots of blacklisted people and some greats. Charlie Chaplin, Arthur Miller, Lena Horne, and Orson Welles, to name a few. And actually, just a few years before he died, when Orson Welles was asked about Kazan during an interview, he would remark, "Chère mademoiselle, you have chosen the wrong metteur en scène because Elia Kazan is a traitor." He held that grudge to the end. So this Hollywood blacklisting was a very serious thing to involve themselves in, but it did offer them a very good money-making opportunity. Beerley would also be prepared to dig further and vet actors, producing exonerations for stars if studios paid for their quote-unquote research. It's an old-fashioned shakedown, a good old-fashioned American shakedown, something that Hoover or Cohn, or indeed one of Cohn's clients, Donald Trump, would absolutely recognize as good business. And one of his first clients was Harry Cohn, who was the president of Columbia Pictures. Columbia had this new young star, Judy Holliday, who appeared in the Spencer Tracy and Audrey Hepburn film Adam's Rib. And she had just won an Academy Award for Best Actress for her film Born Yesterday, beating fellow nominees Bette Davis and Anne Baxter for All About Eve and Gloria Swanson for Sunset Boulevard.
That is, I believe, the gayest selection of Best Actress nominees in world history.
Right, that's a list.
In 1 year, you have Gloria Sunset Boulevard Swanson, Betty All About Eve Davis, and Judy Born Yesterday Holliday.
Yeah.
The number of lines that people are still doing at gay bars that went into those performances to be considered by the Academy is astonishing.
Right.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
So she was going to be this huge star, but there was a snag. Holliday had been subpoenaed to appear in front of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which was investigating communism in the entertainment industry, and it accused her of fundraising for communist front groups.
Which she had,
Yes.
to be clear.
The committee also had some other...
And she was right, to be clear.
Yeah. The committee also had some dirt on her, that Judy had a girlfriend, a lesbian New York cop called Yetta Cohen, and Cohen was a communist. Judy, who lived in the village, and Yetta were quite well-known figures on the village gay scene with plenty of lesbian friends. And it appears with this information of Judy's sexuality and her links with this red cop were then fed to Beerley by Angela. And he included it in his report to Harry Cohen of Columbia Pictures. But the same information, perhaps unsurprisingly, had also found its way to the FBI. I wonder who gave him that. And so it appeared at the hearing. Judy actually defended her friend and former lover, but the mere insinuation of it was bad enough, and so Yetta was fired from her job. And this was a sort of trail of destruction that she left in her wake. These broken men and women, destroyed careers, social movements, gutted activists.
To be clear, Judy Holliday did actually manage to continue her career. Like, she wasn't blacklisted. She succeeded.
She did, but her ex-girlfriend...
But her ex-girlfriend was, yeah. But she did, that name was named. Like, she didn't name the name.
Oh, no, she never named names.
She did this brilliant performance. Yeah. It's one of the great... Actually, I want to now recommend, if you're interested in this particular story, there's a book by a professor who was extremely important to my career and life in many ways, named Kevin Barr. And the book is called Women in the Hollywood Blacklist, and has a lot of great stories about
sounds fascinating,
this particular, yeah.
But yeah, the things were just everywhere she went, she was destroying people's lives as part of this red baiting scare. But for her, obviously everything was coming up Millhouse. And
Was everything coming up roses here?
Yeah. No singing. She published a book called Red Masquerade, which told of her life as an FBI informant, and which she then used to launder her lesbian image. She wrote that she only moved to the village in order to be closer to the art scene. And she also wrote up a sort of fiction of her own femininity, better to play into this model that the red-blooded American conservative would want for a patriotic woman spy, rather than this tweedy butch.
Is the art scene now what we're calling scissoring? I'm wondering, is this the beginning of the detrans grift? Is this the same kind of grift?
Maybe.
Yeah.
When a fellow village lesbian who knew her was given an opportunity to read Red Masquerade, many years later she would comment, quote, "She's talking about picking out the right dress for the trial and doing her hair. That would be the only time she ever wore a dress," end quote. But the book actually did really well, and she became a minor celebrity for a hot moment. And she even appeared to her great acclaim on Eleanor Roosevelt's NBC radio program. Roosevelt was full of praise for what she called this courageous young woman, and they talked about the communist plot against America and her role in it.
Boo, Eleanor.
Yeah.
No.
And her personal life was going just as well. She and Mertis had even bought a house on the proceeds of the book, which was near to her brother-in-law's, Ken, and his wife, Billy. But this 15 minutes of fame couldn't last. After all, what more did she have to say? Her only real role was as an FBI spy, and once she'd told that story, that was that. So the interviews and the fame dried up, and then eventually her relationship with Mertis broke down. But what's more, she'd burned through all her friends. Nobody in the photography world would forgive her, especially when the Photo League, which had been blacklisted itself as a subversive organisation, was shut down, ending the cheap access to darkrooms and tuition that had been so useful to these young working-class photographers. So she couldn't get work, and her friends in the Greenwich Village lesbian scene ostracised her for her role in the firing of Yetta Cohen. The FBI tried to get her work in the movie industry, largely to shut her up. And she got a little photography work with this right-wing American Legion magazine. But by the end of the 50s, that too had dried up. Ken had died, aged just 42. And the Communist Party had been so thoroughly dismembered that it no longer really hung as a boogeyman around the neck of the American subconscious. So instead, she became a landlady, buying property first in the village and then in Provincetown, ironically getting in on the ground floor of these future gay villages that had been enabled by the liberation movement inspired by her communist enemies, former gay communists behind the Matterschein and the GLF. But clearly the stigma of this behaviour stung. People in Provincetown who knew of her past kept her wide berth, and she remained this sort of slightly odd, eccentric local figure. And by the end, she was no longer parading her FBI service as a badge of honour. When asked, she would say that she'd been blackmailed into spying on the League and the party by the FBI threatening her family back in Greece. I think that's an unlikely story. It doesn't explain the lengths that she went to, even against the FBI's wishes, to then build a career off that treachery. in the end, I think it was money that drove her, really, and a desire never to really to return to the poverty of her youth. When she died in her Mexico holiday home in 1995, her estate was valued at nearly $1 million. But her reputation, I believe, has not done so well from inflation. Bad Gaze doesn't run ads, we're not part of a big media network, and we're not underwritten by any big donors. That means our analysis and work is independent, critical, and free for the community.
Only through your generous support can we take the time to write and research each of these extensive episodes. Become part of a community of like-minded listeners by subscribing to Extra Bad Gaze on Patreon or Apple Podcasts.
Every month, you'll get access to our subscribers-only podcast where we discuss the latest in queer politics and culture, and our Gagging Uncle's advice segments, where we take reader questions about sex, relationships, and queer life.
You don't want to miss those segments, nor do you want to miss our new jingle. So join the community at patreon.com/badgazepod or subscribe right in Apple Podcasts. And you can also check out our merch, including hats, beach towels, t-shirts, and of course our book, Bad Gaze, A Homosexual History, at our website, now in English, Spanish, and Italian. Thanks. Thank you, Hugh, for that story. I want to first ask you a question that probably doesn't really matter that much, but I'm just interested. Are her photos any good?
No, they're okay. They're not as good as many of the other people in the league. I've only seen a few of them, but they're okay. They're nothing amazing.
And did she keep taking pictures in her landlady days, or was that really like what she was? It's not like she was a sort of hobby photographer who was like passionately taking pictures even until the end.
I don't know.
But it's not, they haven't survived, hasn't survived that way.
No, she's not now like being reappraised for her photography, that's for sure. Although she does appear in some of the books about the Photo League.
That's fascinating. I think it's really interesting, this move to get in on the ground floor of these gay villages, and you very optimistically maybe credit the emergence of these gay villages to this work that's done by Mattachine, to this work that's done by GLF. And in a way, these gay villages are also a testament to the labors of people like Angela Calomiris, aren't they? Turncoats and traders and people who sought the first possible opportunity to cash in and make a buck.
I guess so, yeah. Maybe I'm being more Pollyanna-ish about it, but I guess what I meant by that was the emergence of a sort of acceptable, legal, public gay identity to a degree allowed for the creation of the villages, not necessarily physically the people buying up the property.
Right, yeah.
Landlords are landlords.
Landlords are landlords, whether gay or not. These networks that are dismantled, they are dismantled, but also some of them survive. Like you even mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this photographer whose name I've now forgotten, who comes to Provincetown and is looking for a place to stay and then sees Calomiris' name and is, God, no, not her, obviously, because she remembers her sort of treachery and these things. So can you speak a little bit more about what kind of happens to these progressive networks in the 1950s and onward?
They do get blasted apart as formal networks. There are still, of course, like groups of friends and stuff, but the energy really gets sucked out of the movement, and especially the cultural movement in the immediate post-war period. So a lot of people who we would now see as these sort of all-American artists, especially the abstract expressionists, had been Trotskyists in the 1930s, people like Jackson Pollock. And of course, there's the now famous story about the fact that actually a lot of the funding for the abstract expressionists in terms of international exhibitions and magazines and things like that was directly funded by the CIA. That's its own fascinating story, as the CIA sort of took against the socialist realism of the Stalinist era. And the way they did that was to produce this art that supposedly embodied the individual genius spirit of the artist as an individual, right, and which they put into abstract expressionism.
The CIA did not develop abstract expressionism. The CIA discovered abstract expressionism and thought that it was a useful way of promoting state interests. But
yeah,
it's not that
it's
not that the abstract expressionists were like knowingly CIA agents. I don't know. There's a way of talking about this that's really pig-headed and annoying.
No, absolutely not.
I know you don't think that, but like people whose response to this is to write Twitter threads about how Jackson Pollock is the CIA.
No, of course.
CIA plot. No, it's just that like any other thing, they promote national interests and they find things that are useful to them. And they thought that this art was useful to national interests. And a lot of the artists involved probably would have been horrified to learn that the CIA was funding them. But.
Yeah. And that is how arts funding works even today. I recently was rejected for a funding proposal I put in to a state agency, but the sort of criteria for that included talking about the environment and ecological impact, and also talking about LGBTQ people and minorities and things like that. These are the same sort of political the use of culture as a political tool is, of course, just part of the system.
Of course.
But it's not necessarily nefarious. It's just...
It just is.
Yeah. So that sort of rise, especially in New York, as a sort of cultural center, taking over from Paris in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, on the back of these new movements that pushed against quote unquote totalitarianism through this sort of individualized artistic production, really blasted apart a lot of the work, but people who are working on stuff with a much broader sort of Trotskyist influence, social conscience in those earlier networks, and that became dreadfully unfashionable.
Right.
And by the time Warhol hit, it was doomed.
Hugh, Angela Calomiris, bad gay.
Absolutely a bad gay. Just
one of the worst.
We mentioned this in an episode a couple of episodes ago about Dante having the lowest circle of hell reserved for traitors. You're just shopping people who put themselves on the line for you, who built communities that attracted you. They were the ones who provided her with the cheap access to the photographic studios. What did the FBI ever do for her before that? And the reasons for it, I think, just come down to probably money. They say in espionage, they have this mnemonic, MICE, meaning which are the reasons that the motivations for people to take part in spying. And it's money, ideology, coercion, and ego. And I think for her, it's probably nearly all money with a little bit of ego.
So Hugh, if people wanted to learn more about Angela Calomiris, what are some of the sources that you used to research this episode?
There's a fantastic biography of her called Undercover Girl, the Lesbian Informant Who Helped the FBI Bring Down the Communist Party by Lisa Davis. It's really good. I got a lot of the information from this episode from that, and I can really recommend reading it. And she, in turn, gives a shout out in that book to Veronica Wilson, who wrote the article, I chose the values I regarded as American, sexuality, ethnicity, and FBI informant Angela Calomiris for a 20th Century Communism journal. And she did a lot of the original research into the FBI files, which uncovered Calomiris' role in the Smith Axe trial, and Lisa Davis acknowledges her debt to her in producing that. There's also a book I used called The Broadcast 4, Women and the Anti-Communist Blacklist by Carol A. Stabile, and The Radical Camera, New York's Photo League, 1936 to 1951 by Mason Klein. And then, as always, I will recommend The Lavender Scare by David K. Johnson. And there was a few other articles I used, one which was The Spy Who Came In From the Closet, also by Lisa Davis for the Gay and Lesbian Review, and an article about her later life for the Provincetown Banner by Sophia Starmack, which was called The Rise and Fall and P-Town Rebirth of Angela Calomiris.
For this week, that's our show. You can learn more about our show and buy our merch, including camo hats and beach towels with Hadrian and Antinous on them at badgayspod.com. You can subscribe to Extra Bad Gays with our Gagany Gunkles segments on patreon.com/badgayspod. You can find the show on social media at badgayspod. You can find me on social media at Ben Writes Things.
And you can read more of my stuff at hugh.substack.com.
Till next week, bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad gays. Bad gays.